Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true to themselves. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true. It's true, it's true, it's true. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true to themselves.
And welcome to episode 3 of Rubber Beauties, the Beauties After Show. Christoph, do you have an ad read for us off the top?
The Rubber Beauties Podcast is brought to you by the Rubber Boots Podcast. Stain your wife's favorite hallway rug? No fear, Jimmy will show you how precious snow covers all. Only on the Rubber Boots Podcast, available wherever you find your podcasts.
Speaking of which, this is more for the Rubber Boots Podcast, but because you mentioned about stained carpets, Hugo, my puppy, for fans of the Rubber Boots Podcast, I don't know if we're getting like new fans that are only listening to Rubber Beauties because they enjoy beauties, or are most people listening to us people that listen to the Rubber Boots Podcast and that are getting bonus Rubber Boots content here on Rubber Beauties? What would you say, Christoph? What do you think the majority of our audience is?
I think it's just a lot of confused people who are trying to sort these podcasts out as best as they can, and I'm with them.
Well, the bottom line is that I talk about my dog and my golf simulator a lot on the Rubber Boots Podcast, and I was getting mad at my dog Hugo the other night because I was trying to practice my wedge play on my golf simulator, and he kept trying to he likes to jump in the net and play with the balls, and so I kept shoving him away, and then I left the room to use the washroom, and I came back and he'd crapped on my golf mat.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
So
he was sending a clear message.
You guys are on the same cycle.
Essentially, yes. That's another thing, by the way. Apparently women who all live in the same house, like at a university per se, they all get on the same cycle.
Yeah.
I don't know if I ever believe.
I'm sorry, are you talking Peloton here?
That's Lester, by the way. This is your first time listening to the Rubber Beauties Podcast. It's Lester.
It's actually my first time.
And James. No, I guess I don't know if this is too personal to share, but my daughter was sharing this with me that all her roommates, there's 5 of them that live in their house at Guelph. They're all pelotoning together, as in those terms. It all happens. There's an alpha female.
Yeah.
They all follow. They all end up same.
Really?
Shines at the same time or whatever.
Wow.
Dancing around this a little bit.
That must be a fun place every 28 days.
So they all do that. They all do that dance through the meadow in slow motion together.
Yes, exactly. We better get to the subject involved. We've just completed. Hopefully, you've just listened to episode 3 of the Beauties Podcast called Hully. One of my favorite interviews that I did for this book was with Kelly Chase for this particular chapter. We did it in a hotel downtown. He was in town for an NHL alumni event, and sat in the lobby of this hotel with him for an hour and a half as he told those Brett Hull stories. And I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed listening to them.
Yeah, it's going to be hard to top that one. He was so good at telling the stories. His Brett Hull impersonation is spot on. And you could actually Brett Hull is one of the great characters ever to play sports.
He really is. And it's funny you say that, because in writing the book and in doing this podcast with Stoff, there's some of the stories where I have to use my voice more because the story might look good in the book, but it's not told as well. You know what I mean? The storyteller maybe doesn't have the cadence and the rhythm. But in this particular case, Chase, I don't even have to say anything. I could just let him go for an hour straight, right?
Yeah.
Speaking of which, there were several stories we left out of the podcast and the book just because we simply, we could have written an entire book. So here's one about Garth Butcher, who, by the way, has his own chapter in Beauties and perhaps a later podcast. But here's one about Hully and Garth Butcher that did not make it into the pod.
Garth Butcher knocked him off his chair at the Whistling Oyster here in Toronto, punched him right in the face, and he was our captain, and he loved Butchie, and Butchie loved him. He goes, I quit until Brian Sutter becomes the old Brian Sutter, because he had been with Keenan for the summer for the Canada Cup, and he said, he's starting to act like Keenan, and Butchie saying, Hully, calm down, you're being loud. And their lunch had gone into happy hour already, so you can see how this is going. And Hully's got his feet locked in the chair, and there's like 4 of us there. And so it's Brett Hall in Toronto. People know who he is. And Butch says, hey, keep your voice down and quit saying you're not playing until Brian changes, because I've had it with you, and I'll punch you right in the face. You're not going to punch me. He goes, I'm going to punch you in the face if you don't shut up. And Hully kept, you won't punch me. And boom, Butch knocked him right over on his chair at the Whistling Oyster, and he's on his back. And he goes, oh, now you're going to beat me up. And we laugh about it today, but Hully could get under your nerves where you want to strangle him.
That's awesome.
I could see that.
I just love. I haven't spent a ton of time with Brett Hall in my career, certainly social time, but you're so right, Puffy, how well he nails him. There was back Wayne Gretzky had a celebrity golf tournament. The Day I Almost Killed Two Gretzky's, my first book, was based on a story that happened at that tournament. But it was a tournament where the celebrities all played with pros, and Hully's a really good golfer, and after the first day, Gino Reda and his partner were winning the tournament. Uh-huh. And I remember Hully at the bar. He comes in, and the leaderboard was up on a screen at the bar, and Hully goes, Gino Reda, he can't even advance the ball. Which is not true. Gino is not that bad a golfer, but it was just the way Hully said it was classic. He also talked about Patrick Roy, and here's a little bit about Hully and Patrick Roy.
He was reading the newspaper about Patrick Roy in Montreal, and I remember him looking at the newspaper and making a comment like they were, Patrick was so good and was such a dominant player. And his comment was, we'll see tonight how good he is. And I think he had 3 in the first period on Patrick.
Yeah, and that was one of the interesting things, I think, in Kelly's stories, is that Hully did not want to score more than a hat trick. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He did not want to have 4-goal games or 5-goal games because he thought that was embarrassing the other teams. So quite often he'd have a hat trick midway through the game, and then he'd just turn it off.
I'm sure his coach loves that, yeah. My best player decided I'm not going to score anymore.
Now, when you say turning it off, do you mean that he would... Oh, you still there? Did you say he would...
Sorry, my phone keeps falling down.
That he would turn it off and that he would stop playing completely, or he would just not want to score anymore?
Wouldn't score.
So he'd have a good chance and he'd give it a pass. Like that.
Correct. Well, two separate things. He did not want to score more than a hat trick, and he did not want to score. He went through a stage of his career where he refused to score empty net goals because he thought they were cheap. And you hear Kelly say in the podcast and in the book that he figures he could have had another 150 goals or something, which would put him in the realm of Wayne Gretzky. So I'm not sure that that's quite accurate, but it's
crazy. Usually, guys who are goal scorers, they're crazy about they live to score goals, and they'll do anything to score goals.
Phil Esposito said, "Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, go ahead."
Have a guy like that who was such a, probably one of the best goal scorers of all time, and he would put these limitations on himself. It's kind of interesting.
But it's very interesting, given what you hear about it, what we're hearing about his personality, that he had those things, which I respect very much. I mean, but some guys, Ovechkin certainly loves scoring goals. But I remember we were doing this for Classic. We were doing the 72 Summit Series. We interviewed Phil Esposito, and he said he loved scoring goals too. And he said the sound of the puck going into the net, it was like he was obsessed with it. It was almost obscene to him that he would like that sound, right? You know what I mean? So,
well, I think it goes along with Hull's personality. Remember the famous quote about, I don't love hockey, or I don't like hockey, I'm just good at it, or whatever that quote was.
Yep, I remember that.
That he's a quirky guy. I don't know, there's been few guys that have that much natural talent. A guy who he's not Hully. I'm not going to make that comparison. It would go to his head, but there's a little bit of Jeff O'Neill in Brett Hall. in the sense of the character and the natural ability to score. And, O-Dog gets given a hard time sometimes that maybe he could have been more in the NHL if he took care of his body more, if he took the game more seriously. And maybe, but the guy, anybody who plays more than 10 years in the NHL, I have a ton of respect for. The guy scored more than 40 goals in the NHL, but that natural ability. I remember we did, I'm sure you guys took part. TSN has done a ball hockey tournament for a couple of years. And the first year they got O-Dog to play. So I think it was like the overdrive team. So O-Dog and Noodles and Hayes were playing. And O-Dog just stood at center, I guess you don't call it center ice, center road. And didn't really run around much, but just fired the puck. And he scored. I was reffing the game, and he scored about 6 goals on about 7 shots, just firing those little orange balls, top corner. And, after not playing hockey for whatever, probably first time he grabbed a stick in 5 years. Yeah. And that natural ability. And obviously Brett Hull had that 10-fold level to be able to just do whatever he wanted and score. And that, I think it just makes him a fascinating character.
I think, for Brett especially as well, I think about guys like, I love Brett because, not to say that I'm nowhere close. Jeff O'Neill believes a right-hand shot. Brett's a right-hand shot as well. And that one-timer that Brett had from the slot, I think you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody in history that could release the puck that quickly. Now.
Well, Puffy and I have heard the story that is near the beginning of this podcast and that chapter of the book, where he basically decides to end the game against the Kings in Los Angeles because the team wanted to go out that night, scores with 10 seconds left in the game, and skates to the bench and says, like we're playing overtime in LA.
Puffy is the best teammate ever.
Puffy and I had heard that story, I think, multiple different times on the panel, but I'd never seen it in a book somewhere, and that's why we wanted to get that one in there. I'm not sure if that's my favorite or the one about Bobby Hull in the book. That
is the number one story of all time.
That's my favorite. Working on the podcast, obviously, I read the chapter before, and then when I edit these things, I hear it about 100 times. Every time I hear that Bobby Hull story, I laugh every single time.
That image of Bobby Hull with the tray full of food that he's picked up from outside people's hotel rooms, and then taking off his rug and hanging it on the bedpost is just,
Kelly Chase is like, this is my hero, and this is what he's doing. He almost sounds sad about it. It was so good.
I had heard rumblings about that Brett Hull going through hallways and picking up food off trays for a few years, but I'd never seen an eyewitness to it like Kelly Chase was. So anyway, Chase was one of our favorites. He also appears in a later chapter and likely podcast that we'll do about Layla Anderson, the young girl who inspired the St. Louis Blues to win the Stanley Cup in 2019. But we thank Chaser, who's just an unbelievable storyteller. Let's have one more story, bonus material here on the Rubber Beauties podcast that did not make it into the pod. Go ahead.
Or when Mike Lawler got traded to Washington, Lawless was coming around the net, and he would kind of bank the puck off the wall. That was his game, bank the puck off the wall, bank the puck off the wall. And Hully was so damn hard on him, I think it was making him nervous. He was getting to the point where it's coming around the wall, a foot off the ice, and we're having to stop it, and he'd be complaining, and the next thing, Laws started coming around the net, and he'd flip it a mile high into the neutral zone because he didn't want to give him that pass on the wall. It was a foot off the ice. So he'd come around, he'd toss it in the air, a mile in the air. And Hully would just be dragging his stick behind him, come back. Well, Laws eventually got traded. He was having a tough year, and he was going to Washington. And the reporters came down and said, you guys have lost another guy that's won a Stanley Cup, because Mike had won a Stanley Cup in Montreal. He said, how does that affect, the experience side of it and everything? And Hully's getting undressing, and they got the mics in front of me. He goes, well, guys, it was him or the clock. One of them had to go.
Oh, what a piece of work. One more thing before we leave you here on Rubber Beauties. I think I can say now that with the success of Beauties book, which you can buy anywhere you find bookstores now. Off to a very good launch, one of the top-selling books in the country. Thank you.
Nice.
The success of the Beauties podcast, doing very well, thanks to the incredible production of Christoph Mamona, one of the most popular podcasts in the country. TSN is unveiling, I believe we're beginning November 2nd, a Beauties television segment where all new stories. There might be a couple of stories from the book, but for the most part, they're all new, fresh material stories, not from the pod or the book. And they're going to be animated. So they're going to be like, we're going to take the beauty stories and turn them into little cartoons. And we've already got Craig Chambers, one of our good buddies, who is not just a great producer, but apparently he can animate, has been doing these things, and the few that he's done so far are absolutely terrific. So Beauties is extending from the literary world and the podcast world into the television world, coming your way on SportsCenter come November 2nd. So check that out. Check out, please, if you once again listen to Rubber Beauties before Beauties, please go back and listen to Beauties. Stoff, is there an ad read perhaps before we go?
Yeah, before we go, we should remind our listeners that the Rubber Beauties podcast is brought to you by the Rubber Boots Season 5 Intern Search. Do you like stuff? Apply within for a chance to be immortalized alongside intern Steve on the Rubber Boots Intern Hall of Fame.
His name is Zach. His name is not Steve. Our first intern's
I was
name
trying to remember.
is Zach. Thanks for listening to Rubber Beauties. Be sure to check out Rubber Boots if you have not yet. We're about to tape another fine episode of the Rubber Boots podcast right after this. We'll see you next time on Rubber Beauties.
Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true to themselves. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true. It's true, it's true. Rubber Beauties, Rubber Beauties, they're true to themselves.
Are you wearing your rubber boots tonight?